I'd lived a long life and thought nothing could surprise me anymore. But that year, climbing a snow-covered road toward a mountain hotel, I had no idea this trip would take more from me than all the hard years combined, and at the same time give back something I'd thought was gone forever. I didn't believe in justice then, or in fate. I was just a tired man who wanted quiet. What I got instead was snow, fear, and a truth that still stops my heart. People had called me by my profession my whole life, accountant. I'd counted other people's money for nearly 40 years, careful, honest, and dull as a neatly stacked pile of papers. When I retired, it turned out there was nothing left to count, and more importantly, no one who needed me. My wife had passed away 2 years before. The children lived far away and called on holidays. So to keep from losing my mind in an empty apartment, I packed a small suitcase and set off for somewhere I'd long dreamed of going. High up in the mountains, to a little hotel that promised no bustle, no crowds, just snow, silence and clean air. The road up was long. The old bus carrying us from the station groaned around every bend like a living thing. Spruce-covered slopes dusted with the first snow stretched past the windows, and the higher we climbed, the quieter it got inside. I watched the white peaks and thought that maybe here, at last, I'd be able to breathe again. There weren't many of us on the bus. I noticed right away the elderly woman sitting a few rows ahead, straight-backed as a post with neatly pinned gray hair. She had the face of someone who had made a habit of keeping her composure no matter what. I later learned her name was Elena, and that she'd spent nearly her whole life as a schoolteacher. I didn't know yet that her face would set off a chain of events that would turn everything upside down. Across the aisle sat a young couple. The girl's name was Anna, the young man's was Mark. They held hands and laughed quietly at something private between them. I watched them and remembered myself when I was young, driving somewhere with my wife, not knowing what was ahead, happy simply because we were together. Anna had an open, luminous quality about her, eyes you wanted to trust. Mark struck me as slightly on edge. He kept glancing out the window as if he were waiting for something or afraid of someone. I put it down to road fatigue. In the back corner, alone, sat a sullen, middle-aged man. He spoke to no one, stared at a fixed point, and let out a heavy sigh from time to time. One of the drivers had referred to him as an engineer. Apparently, he'd once worked on some major construction project. His face wore a look of deep, settled resentment, the kind you see on people who took a serious blow from life and never quite got back on their feet. I couldn't have imagined then how much we all had that resentment in common. And then there was one more. He boarded the bus last, at an intermediate stop, and immediately seemed to fill the entire space. Tall, well-groomed, with a pleasant smile and a warm voice, he greeted everyone as if we were old friends. He pulled a thermos from his bag and offered hot tea to Elena, who'd been shivering. He helped the engineer shift a heavy bag. He said something light to Anna and Mark that made even the gloomy back corner of the bus warm up a little. I watched him and thought, now there's a person who carries a light inside them, and everyone nearby feels it. How wrong I was. That light wasn't warmth. It was the kind of fire that burns through lives. But more on that later. We kept climbing. The snow came down heavier, the road narrowed, and the driver slowed to a crawl. Our charming fellow passenger poured out tea and told stories about his travels, distant places, remarkable people he claimed to have met along the way. He told them beautifully, too beautifully, as I understood later. But in that moment, we all sat there hanging on his every word and forgot our fatigue entirely. I remember Elena taking a sip of tea, thanking him and saying she hadn't met such a considerate young man in a long time. He smiled back and said that kindness always finds its way home. I nodded to myself. Old fool. I believed that too, that kindness comes back around, that honesty is rewarded, that in the end everyone gets what they deserve. Life had spent years trying to convince me otherwise, but I'd held stubbornly to that belief. The bus made its final turn, and the hotel came into view. A solid stone building with a sloping roof pressed against the mountainside as if it had grown straight out of the rock. Smoke rose from the chimneys. Warm yellow light glowed in the windows. After the long, cold ride, the sight of it felt almost magical. I thought, this is it, the place where I'll find some peace. If only I'd known that we would walk out of that house as completely different people. That one of us wouldn't walk out at all. And that the man who'd just been pouring our tea and smiling like family would turn out to be the reason we all lost everything. But that evening we were simply glad of the warmth. We stepped off the bus, breathed in the frost, and our charming companion was first to pick up Elena's suitcase and carry it to the door, gallantly stepping aside to let her through. I came last, glancing back at the mountains, feeling nothing but calm. The calm lasted exactly one evening. That first night at the communal table, we all laughed like old friends. And none of us suspected that the man raising his glass to our health had already, at some earlier point, taken the most precious thing from each person sitting at that table. The hotel was even cozier than I'd expected. Inside it smelled of wood, fresh bread and pine. A fire crackled in the large hall, surrounded by deep armchairs. The owner was a sturdy, no longer young man everyone simply called the host. A man of few words, with work-worn hands and a steady gaze. He cooked, stoked the furnaces and cleaned, all himself. Helping him was a young woman, his niece, whom he'd brought up for the winter. There were few guests at this time of year, the 6 of us and no one else. 2 other expected arrivals hadn't made it because of the weather. Over dinner we finally got properly acquainted. The host served a thick soup, warm bread and a hot herbal drink, and conversation started up naturally around the table. Elena, the school teacher, turned out to be a remarkably lively presence. She talked about her students with such affection, it was plain that the school had been her whole life. She said she'd raised several generations of children, that she still remembered many of them by name decades later, that there was no greater joy for her than running into a former student on the street and finding they'd become a good person. Listening to her, I thought, now there's a truly rich life, the kind that isn't measured in money. I didn't know yet that she'd had enough money until quite recently for a comfortable old age, and that it was gone. The young couple, Anna and Mark, shared that they'd just gotten married and had been saving for this trip as their honeymoon. Anna was a nurse, a fact that would matter later very much. Mark said little about himself, mostly nodded and smiled, and I noticed again how he tensed up every time the charming guest began to speak. As if there were some invisible thread between them. I told myself I was imagining things. The engineer loosened up somewhat over dinner. After a couple of swallows of the hot drink, he began to talk, and described how he'd once managed a large construction operation, how he'd had his own firm, a house, a car, people's respect. And then everything collapsed in a single year. He didn't explain why, he just waved it off and said he trusted the wrong person. I noticed that at those words our charming guest stopped smiling for just a moment. 1 second. Then he put his mask of warmth back on. And the man himself, our charming fellow passenger, spoke about his own life freely and fluently. He said he worked in investments, that he helped people grow their savings, that what mattered to him wasn't money but people's trust. He looked each of us in the eye, addressed everyone by name, and remembered every small detail that had come up in conversation. He had that particular kind of charm that disarms you completely. Elena positively glowed sitting near him. Even the engineer gradually relaxed. Only Mark sat with his eyes down. I watched everyone at that table and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, as though I were part of a family again, part of some warm, close circle. I even opened up a little about myself, about work, about my wife, which wasn't something I usually did. Our charming guest listened to me more attentively than anyone else, nodding, offering exactly the right words of sympathy. When I mentioned that after my wife's death I'd put some of my savings aside to leave the children something, he leaned forward with interest and asked where exactly I'd invested. I didn't think anything of the question at the time. I told him the name of the scheme a friend had talked me into a couple of years earlier. A scheme that had promised good returns. A scheme that later vanished without a trace, taking my money and the money of thousands of other people with it. I remember how our charming guest nodded and said, yes, he'd heard about that. A sad business. So many people hurt. The people behind it ought to be held accountable. He said it with such genuine indignation that I trusted him even more. There, I thought, is a good man. Someone who understands another person's pain. I didn't know then that I was talking to the very man responsible, that the person shaking his head in sympathy for defrauded pensioners was the one who had defrauded them. That my money, Elena's money, the engineer's savings, Anna and Mark's nest egg, all of it had passed through his hands and settled somewhere we could never reach. The evening moved along slowly and warmly. Outside, the snowfall was picking up, but inside the dining room it was cozy. The host put more logs on the fire. The niece brought out hot herbal tea. We talked about life, about children, about how quickly the years go by. Elena recited poetry from memory and her voice was soft, the way a real teacher's voice is. Anna rested her head on Mark's shoulder. Even the sullen engineer smiled once. And our charming guest raised his glass and offered a toast. He said that some meetings aren't accidents, that fate had brought us together in this warm house among cold mountains for a reason. That he was glad for every one of us, and he drank to the hope that we'd remember these days for the rest of our lives. We did remember them. God knows, we remembered those days for the rest of our lives. Just not the way he'd promised. That night, when I'd already gone to bed and was lying there listening to the wind outside, I suddenly felt uneasy. No reason for it, the way old men sometimes do. I put it down to an unfamiliar bed and the unusual quiet. I closed my eyes and fell asleep. And toward morning, the mountain moved. I was woken by a sound I had never heard in my life and hope never to hear again. It wasn't thunder, and it wasn't an explosion. It was a low, heavy rumble that made the walls tremble, the windows ring, and your heart clenched tight. As though the mountain above us had shifted in its sleep and breathed out. I jumped out of bed in the dark, not knowing where I was or what was happening. Through the window, in the grey light before dawn, I saw something terrifying. An enormous white wall of snow rolling down the slope, snapping trees like matchsticks and throwing up a cloud of icy powder. An avalanche. It passed about 300 meters from the hotel, off to one side, but the ground still shook beneath us and the roar was loud enough to hurt your ears. I ran out into the corridor in just my shirt. The others were already crowding the hallway, pale, frightened, half-dressed. Anna was pressed against Mark. Elena stood with one hand against the wall, her lips trembling. The engineer stared out the window with the grim understanding of someone who knows what real disaster looks like. The hotel owner was already dressed and doing his best to calm everyone down, but I could see the worry in his eyes. When the roar died away, a deafening silence set in. We all stood there without a word, listening for a second wave. It didn't come. But what we saw when the light finally came up took away any hope of a peaceful stay. The avalanche had buried the only road down. Where a narrow ribbon of highway had wound its way just the day before, there was now a layer of snow, ice, and fallen trees many meters deep. The road was gone. We were cut off from the rest of the world on a mountaintop, in a stone house surrounded by a white wilderness. The owner tried to call down to the valley for help, but the line was dead. Whether the avalanche had cut the cable or the weather was killing the signal, the phone wouldn't work, and the single landline in the hotel gave back only a flat, empty tone. We tried the phones we each carried. Not one of them could find a signal. We were completely isolated. Anna was the first to break. She began crying quietly, and Mark held her, whispering something in her ear. Elena sank into the armchair by the cold fireplace, one hand pressed to her chest. The engineer swore under his breath and hit the wall with his fist. And I stood in the middle of the room and felt a cold, clammy dread rising inside me. Not for myself, I'd already had my life, but for these people who had become almost like family to me over the course of a single evening. The owner gathered us all in the dining room and spoke calmly and steadily. He said it was too early to panic. The hotel was solidly built and had weathered worse storms than this. They had enough food and firewood for 2, maybe 3 weeks, if they were careful about it. Sooner or later, people down in the valley would notice the silence and send rescue teams to clear the road. All we had to do was hold on and keep our heads. His words helped a little. We were warm, under a roof, with food and water. Not out in the open, buried in snow. It could have been far worse. We began, slowly, to pull ourselves together. The owner and his niece got the fireplace going, heated water, and gave us a hot breakfast. And gradually, the fear gave way to something closer to acceptance. All right, we were stuck. We'd wait it out. What else could we do? Our charming guest rose to the occasion here as well. He was the first to volunteer to help the owner carry firewood. He sat with Elena, holding her hand and telling her everything was going to be fine. He made jokes that cut the tension, and little by little his presence made things easier for all of us. He seemed to take on the role of the person holding everyone together, and we were grateful to him for it. All of us except Mark. I noticed that Mark, by contrast, had grown even quieter and more withdrawn. He avoided looking at the charming guest, and when the man put a hand on his shoulder once more and said, "Hang in there, friend, we'll get through this," I watched Mark go rigid, the way you do when something cold and unpleasant brushes against you. That day, for the first time, I started paying closer attention to our charming companion. An old accountant's habit, noticing discrepancies, the small inconsistencies in things that ought to add up. And I noticed something odd. When he thought no one was watching, the smile dropped from his face instantly, like a mask pulled off. And then his eyes were completely different, cold, assessing, quick. He seemed to be calculating something, sizing up each one of us. Once I caught that look directed at Elena. He was watching her the way a person does when they've recognized someone and are deciding what to do about it. Then our eyes met, and he immediately smiled again and asked whether I was cold, whether he could bring me a blanket. I thanked him and said no, but something shifted inside me. That evening, after everyone had gone to their rooms, I lay awake for a long time. I listened to the wind and thought about this man. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just tired and frightened, that you can't suspect a decent person simply because his expression changed for a second. I almost convinced myself. Then morning came and everything changed, because Elena, coming down for breakfast, saw the charming guest in the full light of day, without the scarf he'd kept wrapped around him the night before. She saw his face clearly, completely, and she dropped her cup. It shattered on the stone floor, and into the silence that followed, Elena spoke a single word, staring at the charming guest with wide, stricken eyes. You. Just you. But there was so much horror and hatred packed into that one small word that it sent a chill straight through me. We all froze. Elena stood there, white as a sheet, one hand pressed to her mouth, staring at the charming guest as though he weren't a man at all, but a ghost. And he, I saw it with my own eyes, was thrown just for an instant. The smile faltered on his face. Then he collected himself quickly and asked, with practiced concern, whether everything was all right, whether she needed any help. But there was no stopping Elena now. She began to speak, and her voice, usually so gentle, was shaking with anger. She said she recognized him, that she would never forget that face for the rest of her life. That it was him specifically, who had come to her home 2 years ago, sat at her table, drank her tea, and talked her, an old woman, into trusting him with all her savings. Every last coin she'd put aside over a lifetime, for a peaceful old age, for medication, so she wouldn't be a burden to her children. He'd promised her good returns. He'd shown her impressive-looking documents. He'd called her respected and wise. And then he vanished, along with the money. All of it, down to the last penny. A dead silence fell over the room. I watched our charming guest and saw his face change. The mask of warmth and charm was peeling away like plaster off an old wall. And underneath, something entirely different was showing through. Cold, calculating, ruthless. He tried to deny it. In a calm, level voice, he said that Elena must be mistaken, that this sort of thing happened to him often, that people tend to mix up faces, especially at a certain age, especially under stress. He spoke gently, almost sympathetically, and that gentleness made it worse. He was trying to paint Elena as a confused old woman who had lost her mind, right in front of us, after spending the previous evening holding her hand and calling her wise. And then something no one expected happened. The engineer stood up, that same sullen engineer who had barely said a word all evening. He rose slowly from his chair, walked up to our charming guest, and stood there looking him in the face for a long moment. Then he spoke quietly, and that quietness was more frightening than any raised voice. I recognize you too. Not right away. You've changed. You grew that beard, you switched your glasses. But the voice, I'll never forget the voice. It was your voice in my ear on the phone, promising me the world. You're the reason I lost my business, my home, my family. You. I sat there, feeling the floor drop out from under me. Because the name of the project the engineer had invested in was the same as mine. The very same one that had vanished along with my money and the money of thousands of other people who had been deceived. The same project our charming guest had shaken his head over at dinner the night before and said that people like that ought to face consequences. I stood up too. My legs were shaking, but I stood up. And I said that I'd put my savings into that same project. Money I'd wanted to leave my children after my wife died, and that it was gone too. Our charming guest looked from one of us to the other, and with every word we said, his face hardened a little more. He understood that denial was pointless, that fate, the very fate he'd spoken about so eloquently over dinner, had played a cruel trick on him and locked him in a house with the people he'd robbed. Then Anna spoke, quietly, almost in a whisper. She said that she and Mark had also invested in the project, everything they had. Every penny they'd been saving for an apartment, for their future, for children. A trusted acquaintance had recommended it, and that acquaintance had sworn the man was reliable. And at that, Mark, who had been sitting with his head down the whole time, suddenly jerked to his feet and walked out of the room, nearly knocking over his chair. Anna stared after him, bewildered. And I, a foolish old man who notices too much, had a thought for the first time. Where had a young couple gotten an acquaintance who steered them toward this particular man? And why had Mark been so on edge around him from the very beginning? But I had no room for Mark just then, because what was happening in that room was something terrible. Elena, trembling from head to toe, stepped toward our charming guest and looked him in the eyes and asked, "Where is my money?" Simple and direct. Where is the money I was supposed to live out my life on? Where are the medications I can no longer afford? Where is the peaceful old age you stole from me? He said nothing, and that silence held everything. The hotel owner, who had been standing off to one side, stepped forward and placed himself between Elena and our charming guest. He said that no one would lay a hand on anyone in his house, that we needed to stay calm, that we were all stuck here together and had to find a way through it. He was right, but those reasonable words were agonizing to hear when everything inside you is boiling with rage and grief. Our charming guest seized the moment. He stepped back toward the staircase, swept his new, cold gaze across all of us, and said something that still makes my blood run cold. He said, "You're all very upset. Let's talk this through calmly. After all, I can help you. I'm the only one who knows where your money is. And if you're sensible about this, you may yet see it again." And with those words, he smiled. Again. That same smile. And he went upstairs, leaving us standing there below, deceived, shattered, and suddenly aware for the first time that the snowstorm hadn't trapped us with a charming fellow traveler. It had trapped us with a man who had destroyed each of our lives. That evening we gathered in the room without him. 6 people who had been robbed, locked in by the snow on a mountaintop. And when we laid our stories side by side, like piecing together a torn photograph, the picture that formed was so devastating that Elena began to cry again, and my own eyes were burning. We talked for a long time, talking over each other, and gradually it became clear that our charming guest hadn't simply stolen from each of us individually. He'd operated on a grand scale for years, under different names and different guises. The project we'd all invested in was just one of his inventions. There had been others before it, and his victims numbered not in the dozens, but in the hundreds, perhaps the thousands. Elena told her story in full. She'd been saving for 30 years, setting aside money from a teacher's salary. She'd wanted to see out her old age without asking anything of anyone. When this man convinced her to invest, she believed him, because he reminded her so much of her best students, polite, attentive, well-spoken. She gave him everything, and when the money disappeared, she had a heart attack. Since then, she's been living on medication she can barely afford. This trip to the mountains was her last small joy, saved up separately, coin by coin. The engineer talked about losing the work of his entire life. He'd put not just his own money into the project, but his company's funds as well, convinced by the promised returns. When it all collapsed, he was left owing people money he couldn't repay. The company went under, the house went to cover the debts. His wife couldn't take it and left. He said all of this in a flat, hollow voice, not looking at anyone, and there was so much old, settled pain in it that I found it physically hard to breathe. Anna sat with her arms wrapped around herself. She and Mark had lost everything they'd been saving toward a life together. Every dream of their own home, of children, of a future, gone in a single day. She talked, and I watched Mark, who had come back into the room and was sitting in the corner, pale and somehow lost. He wouldn't look up. And the more Anna said, the lower he dropped his head. I told my own story, about my wife who was gone, about the money I'd wanted to leave my children, to be of some use to them even after my death, about how I'd believed, because I wanted to believe, that even in old age I could still do something good. And when we'd said everything there was to say, a heavy silence settled over the room. We sat there, 6 strangers whom a shared misfortune had made into something closer than that. And every one of us was thinking the same thing. Up there, in a warm room, the man who had done all of this was sleeping. The man who had sat at the same table as us, poured tea, made jokes, offered comfort. Knowing who we were, knowing what he had taken from us. The engineer said what everyone was thinking. He said, "Fate has delivered him straight into our hands. The snow has cut us off from the world. There's no law here, no protection for someone like him. There's only us and him. And we can do whatever we want with him." Those words hung in the air, heavy and terrible. I could see the fire in the engineer's eyes, his fists clenched tight. I could see that Elena, gentle Elena the schoolteacher, wasn't objecting. That even soft-spoken Anna was staring at the floor without saying a word against it. And that was when I understood that the snowstorm wasn't our greatest danger. Our greatest danger was that each of us, before the night was out, could stop being who we were. That resentment and the hunger for revenge could turn honest, decent, worn-down people into something they had never been. And that the man upstairs, that con man, was quite possibly counting on exactly that. I spoke then, and I surprised myself with how steady my voice was, and said that we weren't animals. That if we did to him what we were thinking, we'd become just like him. Or worse. That we'd been robbed, had our money taken, but no one could take our souls except ourselves. And that I hadn't lived an honest life just to dirty my hands in old age. They heard me out. The engineer said grimly that honesty was exactly what had brought us to ruin, that men like this one only understood force. Elena said nothing, but I could see that my words had touched something in them, that the human part of them was still alive. And at that very moment, footsteps sounded on the stairs. He came down to us himself, calm, composed, the smile gone, but no fear either. He stood before us, looked each of us over and spoke. And what he said split us down the middle and became the start of the worst trial of all our days in captivity. He said, "I know you hate me, and I know what you've been thinking about all evening. But before you decide my fate, hear me out. Your money is safe, it's hidden, and I'm the only person alive who knows where. Do something to me, and you'll never see a cent of it. But if we come to an agreement, I return every person's share. Think it over carefully. What matters more to you, getting revenge on me, or getting back what you spent your whole life saving up for?" And watching our faces, he added with a faint smile, "I know you better than you think, each of you, and I know there'll be someone who agrees." He looked toward the corner, directly at Mark, and Mark couldn't hold his gaze and turned away. Money. That single word tossed into the hushed room did what the avalanche, the fear and the cold had all failed to do. It split us apart. I watched with my own eyes as something shifted in people I'd come to care about. As through the righteous anger, another thought began to surface, quieter and shameful. What if he really does give it back? What if we could actually get back everything we'd lost? He stood before us, calm and sure of himself, and kept talking. His voice had gone soft again, that warm, enveloping tone, the same one he must have used on each of us once to part us from our savings. He said he understood our pain, that yes, he'd done wrong, but the past couldn't be undone, while the future could still be set right. That the money was in a safe place, every last cent of it intact, and he was prepared to return each person's share on one condition. When we were rescued, we'd let him go free. We wouldn't turn him in. We'd act as though we'd simply waited out the storm together. The engineer broke first. He said he didn't believe a single word of it. That a man who'd spent his whole life lying would lie now too. That the moment we agreed, he'd make all the promises in the world and then simply buy himself time and slip away at the first chance. The engineer was right, and I knew it. But I could also see that even the engineer's eyes flickered with doubt. Because getting back his home, his business, his former life, that was a dream no one could just wave aside. Elena was silent for a long time. Then she asked quietly, "What about the medicine? If I get my money back, I can afford my medicine again. I can live out my old age in peace." There was no greed in her voice, only the exhaustion of a worn-out person who'd just been shown something to hold on to. And that made it all the harder to bear. The con man sensed the weakness and latched onto it immediately. He turned to Elena and spoke to her gently, the way you'd speak to a child. He said she was the one he thought about most. That he couldn't bear to see a woman of her dignity suffering. That he'd return her share first. He lied so skillfully, with such apparent feeling, that even I, knowing exactly who he was, almost believed him for a moment. And that was when I understood what he was really after. He had no intention of returning anything to anyone. What he needed was one thing: to sow discord among us, to divide us, to turn a united group of people who'd been wronged, people who were strong together, into 6 separate individuals, each thinking only of their own money and suspicious of everyone else. Divide and conquer. He'd mastered it. He'd spent his whole life working on human weakness, on greed, on fear, on hope. And now he was playing us like a worn-out, out-of-tune instrument. And it was working. I watched the atmosphere in the room change. The engineer was eyeing Elena with suspicion. Would she be the first to agree? Would she get her share before the rest of them? Anna was thinking hard about something, glancing at Mark, who sat in silence. Each person had quietly started calculating on their own, separately. The warmth that had drawn us together that first evening was coming apart at the seams. I tried to speak up. I said we were being played like children, that he was deliberately setting us against each other, that the moment we believed him and started pulling the blanket our own way, we'd be finished, not as people who'd been robbed, but as people, full stop. They listened, they nodded, but I could feel that the temptation was stronger than anything I could say. The money, the lost money, the hope of getting it back, that spoke louder than any conscience. Then the con man landed his final blow. He looked at Mark, who'd been sitting in the corner the whole time with his head down, and said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear, "Ask your young friend over there. He knows I mean what I say. Don't you, Mark?" Tell them how the two of us met. The room went very quiet. Anna slowly turned toward her husband. Every eye in the room was on him. And Mark sat there, white as a sheet, and said nothing. And that silence said more than any confession could. Anna asked, barely above a whisper, "Mark, what is he talking about? How do you know each other?" Mark raised his eyes to hers, full of anguish, and couldn't get out a single word. His lips were trembling. And in that moment I understood that the secret I'd sensed all the way back on the bus was about to come out. And that it would cut deeper than all our lost money combined. Because some things matter more than money. And the betrayal of someone close to you is one of them. The con man leaned back in his chair and smiled, watching us the way an audience member watches a well-staged drama. He'd gotten what he wanted. He'd planted a seed of discord between us, and now all he had to do was watch it grow. He felt like the one in control. Locked in the snow with the very people he'd swindled, he'd somehow, impossibly, ended up the strongest one in the room again. That night, almost none of us slept. Everyone lay awake with their own thoughts. And toward morning, we discovered that some of the shared food supplies had gone missing from the pantry. And the first aid kit. The same first aid kit that held Elena's heart medication. The disappearance of that kit changed everything. When it had been about money, you could debate conscience and revenge in the abstract as though they were distant theoretical things. But when a sick woman's medication her life depended on, went missing, it was clear. What had taken root among us wasn't just temptation, it was a traitor. Morning began with a cry from the owner's niece. She'd gone down to the pantry to get food for breakfast and found the door, always kept locked, standing open, and part of the supplies gone. Not much had been taken. A sack of grain, a piece of cured meat, a few cans. But in a house cut off from the world, where every bit counted, it was a serious loss. And along with the food, the first aid kit that hung on the wall had disappeared as well. When Elena heard, she went white. Her heart medication was in there. Without it, she knew, any serious shock could be the end of her. And there'd be no shortage of shocks in recent days. She sank into a chair, pressing her hand to her chest, and I rushed to her, afraid an attack was starting right then and there. But she held on, caught her breath. The fear in her eyes, though, remained. The fear of someone who just had their lifeline taken away. The suspicion started at once. The owner examined the pantry door. It had been opened with a key, not forced. And there were only 2 keys, one with him, one with his niece. Which meant someone had taken a key without being seen. Someone among us. One of our own. Everyone looked at each other with a distrust that hadn't been there the day before. The engineer said outright that this was the con man's doing, that he was hiding the supplies to make us dependent, to make us more cooperative once we got hungry enough. It made sense. But the con man only spread his hands and calmly pointed out that he'd been in plain sight all night, that his room was the farthest from the pantry, and offered to have his things searched. They searched them. Nothing was found. And then eyes began to drift, slowly, toward Mark. The same Mark who'd never explained, the night before, how he knew the con man. Who'd been on edge the whole trip, never quite meeting anyone's gaze. Anna stood beside her husband, and I could see the struggle in her. Love on one side and a terrible growing doubt on the other. The silence finally broke him. Mark spoke, and what he told us was worse than anything I could have imagined. He said he'd met this man a few years back. That he'd been young, foolish, and hungry for easy money. The con man had spotted him, seen that weakness, and drawn him in close. At first, Mark just ran small errands. He'd deliver papers, bring acquaintances to meetings, talk up the wonderful scheme to anyone who had doubts. He got a small cut for each one. He was, as people say now, bait. A young face that looked honest, a face people trusted. And then, Mark said, and his voice cracked, then I brought him mine. Friends, family, acquaintances. I swore to them the man was solid, that I checked him out myself, that it was a sure thing. They believed me. They put their money in because they trusted me, and they lost everything. And I took my cut and said nothing. Anna listened and her face turned to stone. In a quiet, terrible voice she asked, "And our money? The money we were saving for a house, for children. Did you give him that too, knowing who he was?" Mark covered his face with his hands, and through his fingers he said, yes. That he'd wanted one last big score, enough to last a lifetime, so he could walk away for good and live clean. That he'd been sure this one wouldn't collapse, that he'd pull their money out before it fell apart. That he'd deceived not just her, but himself. And that not a single day had passed since without him tearing himself apart over it. The room went dead silent. Anna looked at the man she loved, the man she'd married, the man she'd built her dreams with, and she saw a stranger. She saw an accomplice to the person who had destroyed their lives. I'll never forget her face in that moment. It was the face of someone whose ground had just given way beneath them. And the con man, he was enjoying every second of it. He watched Anna shattered with grief, watched Mark crushed under the weight of his shame, watched our stunned faces, and smiled at the corners of his mouth. He'd done what he did best, turned our unity to rubble. We didn't trust anyone now, not even the people closest to us. A chasm had opened up between husband and wife. He'd torn us apart from the inside without lifting a finger. And in that moment, watching that satisfied look on his face, I understood for the first time, truly understood, how dangerous he was. This wasn't about stolen money. The money was just a side effect. His real weapon was his ability to find the weakest, darkest place in a person and drag it into the open, making us destroy ourselves. And if we didn't stop him, we wouldn't walk out of this snowbound house robbed. We'd walk out broken. Strangers to each other forever. We did search that day, of course. We went through the rooms, looked in the storeroom, checked the basement. But it was rushed and scattered, constantly derailed by arguments and accusations. And the conman kept feeding the fire, hinting that someone in our own group had taken the supplies, then steering the conversation back to money, and we turn on each other again and forget about the first aid kit entirely. He deliberately kept us from concentrating. I understand now. He'd hidden it in a place you could only find if you searched calmly, together, and all the way through. And that calm was exactly what he was stealing from us. What I didn't know yet was that the worst was still ahead. Because that night, Elena took a turn for the worse, genuinely bad, and the medications that could have saved her were nowhere to be found. And the con man made it clear that he knew exactly where they were. It happened deep in the night. I woke up to knocking at my door. It was Anna, frightened, standing there in just her nightgown. She'd worked as a nurse, and she knew at once it was serious. Elena was struggling to breathe, clutching her chest, her face gone grey. A heart worn down by years of grief and the shocks of the past few days was giving out. And the medications that could have supported it were lying somewhere unknown, in the missing first aid kit. We carried Elena downstairs to the fireplace where it was warmer. Anna did everything she could, loosening Elena's collar, counting her pulse, speaking to her in a calm voice so as not to frighten her any further. But I could see in Anna's face that without the medication she was helpless. The innkeeper heated water, the engineer paced, not knowing what to do. And Elena lay there, each breath harder than the last. Then he came down the stairs, unhurried, the con man. He stood there and took in the scene. A dying old woman and the people gathered around her. Not a trace of compassion on his face, only cold calculation. He looked at Elena the way you'd look at a lucky card you'd just been dealt. He said he thought he might know where the first aid kit could be. That he'd seen someone come out of the storeroom in the night, and that he was, of course, prepared to help find the medication, under one small condition. I knew in that instant that he was the one who'd hidden the kit, that same night it went missing, that he'd arranged it all in advance, knowing that Elena's weak heart would eventually become his trump card. He hadn't just stolen the medication, he'd taken a human life hostage. And now he was bargaining with it, the same way he'd once bargained with fake returns. The engineer went for him with his fists. I'd never seen a man in such a rage. He grabbed the conman by the collar and screamed at him to hand over the medication right now, or he couldn't be responsible for what he'd do. But the conman didn't flinch. He met the engineer's eyes and said calmly, "Hit me and the old woman dies, because only I know where the kid is. Hurt me and you won't find those medications. Not if you search every inch of this house. Her life is in my hands and in yours. Choose. The innkeeper and I barely managed to pull the engineer back. Not because the conman didn't deserve it, but because he was right. He had Elena's life in his grip, and rage was a poor counselor just then. His condition was simple and devastating. He said, "I'll hand over the medication and return everyone's money. But in exchange, you all swear that when help arrives, you stay silent. No one ever finds out who I am or what I've done. You let me walk away like a friendly fellow traveler, and you swear it on this woman's life." There it was, the price of silence. Elena's life in exchange for our conscience. Save a dying old woman and set free a man who would go on and on destroying other lives. Who tomorrow would deceive another Elena, another engineer, another old man dreaming of leaving something behind for his children. Save one life at the cost of countless lives to come. I looked at Elena fighting for every breath, at Anna holding her hand, at the engineer with trembling shoulders, and I understood that this was exactly the kind of choice life sometimes places in front of a person to find out who they really are. Anna spoke first. Through tears, she said she'd agree to anything as long as Elena lived. That she couldn't watch a person die when there was a way to save her. The engineer, breathing hard, said the hell with him, let the bastard choke on it, as long as they got the medication. And everyone looked at me. Because from the very beginning, I'd been the one talking about conscience, about how we weren't animals, about keeping our hands clean. Everyone was waiting to hear what I'd say. And I looked at Elena dying, and I didn't know what to say. Because it's one thing to talk about principles when nothing is at stake. It's something else entirely when a good person's life hangs on your words. I'd spent my whole life taking pride in my honesty. And now I suddenly understood that I was ready to give up anything at all, just to let Elena take one more breath. I'd already opened my mouth to agree, to swear silence, to let the bastard go free. But in that moment, Elena, who'd seemed barely alive, suddenly gripped Anna's hand and spoke. Her voice was weak and faltering, but it was steady. And what she said changed everything. She said, "Don't you dare. Don't you dare trade your integrity for my sake. I've lived a long life. I spent it teaching children to be honest. And I will not allow this man to go on deceiving people because of me. I'd rather die with a clean conscience than have you live with a dirty one. Give him nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing." The words of a dying school teacher fell over the silent room like a verdict. Not for him, for us. She, lying on the threshold of death, was stronger than any of us, healthy and whole as we were. She showed us that some things no misfortune can take away, as long as you don't surrender them yourself. Looking at that frail, breathless woman, a woman who'd refused to buy her life at the cost of someone else's conscience, I felt something returning to me that I'd nearly lost in those terrible days. My faith in people. The conman faltered. For the first time, his calculations had failed him. He was used to fear and greed being the strongest forces in a person. He'd built his entire life on that conviction, and he was almost never wrong. But here, a dying old woman had shattered his game with a single word. He couldn't make sense of it. In his world, there was no room for what Elena had called a clean conscience. And because he couldn't make sense of it, he grew nervous. He started talking faster, more insistently, raising his price. He promised to repay the money twice over. He swore that Elena shouldn't have to die because of someone's stubbornness. But the more he talked, the clearer it became to all of us who he really was, and what his words were actually worth. The mask he'd worn so skillfully had slipped for good. Standing before us was no charming travel companion, not even a cool-headed operator. Standing before us was a man backed into a corner who had suddenly realized that the snow hadn't trapped him with victims, it had trapped him with judges. And then the engineer did something none of us had managed to do in all those days of fighting. He said, "Enough. Enough tearing into each other." Before, we'd been searching separately, angry, and the man had been throwing us off. So let's try something different. If he hid the first aid kit last night, it's somewhere nearby. He hadn't left the building, there was a storm outside and there were no tracks in the snow. So it was in the house. And we'd find it ourselves, calmly, together, without him. We turned the whole hotel upside down. We searched everywhere, the rooms, the basement, the attic, the woodshed. And we found it. The first aid kit had been hidden behind the woodpile, tucked into a niche in the old stonework that the conman had apparently scouted out in advance. The stolen food was there too. Anna grabbed the medicine and ran to Elena. She knew what she was doing. After a few agonizing minutes, Elena's breathing steadied, color came back to her face, and she opened her eyes. She was alive. We'd saved her. Without his help, without his conditions, without selling a piece of ourselves to do it. And in that moment, something shifted in the air. We were together again. We were the family that had taken shape on that first evening. The con man had lost his only card to play, and he knew it. What happened next, I remember as though through fog. When he understood the game was over, that we'd found the medicine and were no longer in his power, he panicked. He realized that once we were rescued, there'd be no escaping it. 6 witnesses would tell everything. So he made a desperate move. Deep in the night, when the storm had eased a little, he gathered the most valuable things he had. A few documents that must have been the key to wherever he'd stashed the money, and slipped out of the house. He intended to go alone, over the mountains, up the very slope the avalanche had come down. He must have figured he could reach the valley ahead of the rescuers and vanish forever, the way he always had. I woke to the sound of the front door slamming. I woke the others. We rushed out into the cold and saw him in the moonlight, climbing up the loose, treacherous slope. The engineer shouted for him to come back. The slope wasn't safe, that after the avalanche the snow was barely holding together. But the con man didn't listen. He kept climbing, clutching his precious bag of documents to his chest. Documents that led to money. Money that meant more to him than his own life. And the mountain answered. That same low, heavy rumble as the first morning. The snow began to move beneath him. We shouted for him to drop the bag. We reached out. The innkeeper threw him a rope. But he wouldn't let go of what he'd taken. Even then, on the edge of death, he chose the money. And the slab of snow slid softly, almost silently, carrying him down into the dark. We found him in the morning when it got light. The snow had pinned him, but hadn't buried him completely. He'd caught on a rocky ledge. Alive but broken, spent, half frozen. His precious bag of documents had disappeared into the snow. The greed that had governed him his whole life had very nearly cost him that life. And then something happened that he almost certainly didn't expect. We could have left him there. No one would have blamed us. He was a thief and a liar, a man who'd held Elena's life in his hands for his own gain. But we didn't leave him. The engineer, the very engineer he'd ruined, was the first one down the rope to pull him out. Anna, setting everything else aside, dressed his wounds. We saved him, not for his sake, for our own. To stay human. So that Elena, watching us, could know that a lifetime of teaching children to be decent had not been wasted. The rescue team broke through to us on the 12th day. I remember hearing the distant rumble of machinery clearing the road, and all of us pouring out onto the porch and looking down at the valley, watching life push its way back toward us. I remember Elena, stronger now, standing with her hand on my arm and crying quietly. But they were different tears than the ones at the beginning. And I remember that in that moment I was happier than I'd been in years. When they brought us down, everything unfolded the way it should. We didn't stay silent. We told everything. About the con man, about the people he'd defrauded, about the hidden money. Those documents he'd carried up the slope, the ones we dug out of the snow, turned out to be the key to all of it. Through them, the authorities found what he'd hidden. Not right away, not all of it, but they found it. And each of us got back part of what we'd lost. Elena recovered her savings. Not all of them, but enough to buy her medicine and see out her old age without hardship. She wrote to me afterward that she felt like a person again, not a burden. The engineer recovered part of his money and, more importantly, recovered his belief that justice is possible after all. He slowly began rebuilding his business. Anna and I got our shares back. Money isn't the most important thing, of course, but it had been an injustice, and having it corrected made something feel lighter inside. And the con man? He survived. We'd saved him, and he answered for everything he'd done, to us and to hundreds of others he'd swindled over the years. Once the full scale of his fraud came to light, there were a great many people he had to face. I felt no hatred toward him, no satisfaction either, only a strange, quiet pity for a man who had lived his whole life and accumulated nothing but other people's suffering, and who, at the decisive moment, had chosen a bag of papers over his own survival. He was poorer than any of us he'd robbed, poorer because he didn't have what we had. He didn't have each other. The hardest road was Mark and Anna's. Their wound wasn't the kind that heals when the money comes back. Anna couldn't forgive her husband right away. And how could anyone forgive something like that right away? But during those days in the mountains, fighting together for Elena's life, pulling together from the snow the very man who had wrecked their world, something between them had begun to knit back together. Mark told everything, holding nothing back, to the investigators, to the people he'd once led to the con man. He understood what it would cost him, and he said it all anyway. That act, that late, honest reckoning, seems to be what might one day allow Anna to look at him differently. I don't know whether they stayed together, but I know that Mark stopped being the man he'd been, and that's not nothing. We went our separate ways, 6 strangers the snow had locked together and hardship had made into family. But we didn't lose touch. We write to each other, call sometimes, mark each other's occasions. Elena sent me a birthday card in her beautiful teacher's handwriting. The engineer came to visit me once, and we talked until midnight about everything under the sun. These people became the family I hadn't had since my wife died. And strange as it sounds, I'm grateful to that snow-covered mountain for it. I think often about those 12 days, about how easily a person can be stripped of money, a home, a lifetime of savings, everything that takes years to build. And how hard it is to strip them of what matters most, as long as they don't give it away themselves. The con man hadn't tried to take our money. He'd taken that long ago. He tried to take our humanity, to turn us against each other, to divide us, to make us betray one another and ourselves. And he almost succeeded. What saved us wasn't strength or cleverness or even justice. What saved us was a dying old school teacher who had the courage to say, "Don't trade your conscience, not even for my life." I've lived a long life, and I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. I was wrong. Those 12 days snowbound taught me more than all the years before them combined. They taught me that real wealth isn't about how much money you have. It's about having people you can reach out to, and people who'll reach back. That justice sometimes runs late, but it does arrive. And that the most precious thing a person has is the right, in a hard moment, to look themselves in the mirror and not look away. The snow melted from that mountain long ago, but the light that came alive in me there, in that cold stone house, among people who'd been deceived and yet never broken, that light is still burning, and I know it never will go out.